The letter hit the floor of Clark Yates' kitchen with a sound like a verdict being read aloud. Maude Bell stood in the center of that kitchen, her dark hair still pinned from the ride, her jaw set in a way that suggested she had rehearsed this moment, and rehearsed it again, and still could not make it feel less like swallowing broken glass. She had come all the way from Philadelphia. She had left behind a position at the Hargrove Institute, a salary that would make most men in Cimarron County weep with envy, and a life she had spent 7 years constructing piece by careful piece. She had left all of it, every single piece, and come to this ranch in the New Mexico territory, and she had presented herself as a housekeeper. And now the letter had fallen and Clark Yates had read it, and he was looking at her with those dark eyes that had already been too perceptive from the very first morning she arrived, and he said, very quietly, "You have a degree from the University of Pennsylvania." "I am aware of what I have," Maude said. "A degree in accounting and economic theory." He said each word with the slow deliberateness of a man walking across ice, testing each step before committing to the next. "You managed payroll for a company employing 400 people." "I also know how to mop a floor. Maude, I did not deceive you about the housekeeping. I can do everything I said I could do. You told me you had experience managing a household. The Hargrove Institute had 47 rooms and a dining staff of 12. That qualifies." Clark Yates picked the letter up from the floor. He turned it over in his hands like it might reveal something different if he studied it long enough. The letter had come from a Mr. Elias Drummond, and it was addressed not to Maude Bell the housekeeper, but to Maude Bell the woman whose testimony before a Philadelphia court had nearly brought down Drummond's banking enterprise the previous spring, before the case collapsed under the weight of a disappeared judge and 2 witnesses who had suddenly, in the way that witnesses sometimes do when powerful men apply the right kind of pressure, changed their statements entirely. The letter said, in precise and cold language, that Maude's hidden whereabouts were no longer so hidden. It said that Mr. Drummond was a patient man. It said that debts of honor must eventually be repaid. Clark set the letter on the kitchen table and looked at the woman standing across from him, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the wind working its way around the eaves of the ranch house and the distant low of cattle from the south pasture. It was the spring of 1883, and the New Mexico territory was 3 years away from statehood and a lifetime away from anything resembling safety for a woman who had made an enemy of a man like Elias Drummond. "How long have you been running?" Clark asked. Maude's composure cracked then just slightly, just at the corners of her dark eyes. "6 months," she said. "I have been running for 6 months." He did not reach for her. He did not say anything immediately comforting. What he did was pull out the second chair at the kitchen table and sit down in it and put his hands flat on the table and say, "Then you had better start at the beginning." And that was the moment, later, much later, that Maude would identify as the one where she first understood she might be in a great deal of trouble where Clark Yates was concerned. Not the danger kind of trouble, though that was present in abundance. The other kind. The kind that starts with being seen and ends with something you cannot put a proper name to. She pulled out the opposite chair and sat down, and she began. 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1880, Maude Bell had been the most precise and effective financial administrator the Hargrove Institute had ever employed. She had come to the position via a route that was, to say the least, unconventional for a woman of that era. Her father, Professor James Bell, had been a mathematician of some modest renown at the University of Pennsylvania, and he had educated his daughter with the same rigorous exactness he brought to his scholarship, apparently either unbothered by or deliberately subversive of the general social understanding that such education was wasted on women. He had died in 1879, leaving Maude with a first-class education, no money to speak of, and a world that was deeply uninterested in what she had to offer. She had persisted anyway. This was, she would have told you, her defining characteristic and also her most fundamental flaw. The position at Hargrove came through a chain of improbable connections, and Maude had held it by being twice as good as anyone expected and 3 times as discreet. She had understood very quickly that her job was not merely to manage numbers but to manage perceptions, and she was skilled at both. She was 30 years old when Elias Drummond walked into the Institute's administrative office with a proposal for a substantial endowment, and she was the one who reviewed the accompanying financial documents, and she was the one who noticed, buried in 7 pages of otherwise impeccable bookkeeping, the evidence of a systematic fraud that had been bleeding the accounts of 8 separate charitable organizations for nearly 4 years. She had not immediately known what to do with this discovery. She had sat with it for 2 weeks, the knowledge of it sitting in her chest like a stone she could not dislodge, while she quietly, methodically, compiled every piece of supporting documentation she could find. And then she had gone to the district attorney's office. What followed was a year of hope, and then a complete unraveling. The judge assigned to the case had a relationship with Drummond that was never formally proven but was apparent to anyone paying attention. The witnesses recanted. The documentation was called insufficient. The case fell apart in a single afternoon courtroom session that left Maude standing on the courthouse steps in the November cold, watching a man who had stolen from widows and orphaned children walk out into bright sunshine, surrounded by lawyers, untouched. 3 days later, a brick came through the window of her apartment. She left Philadelphia on the 4th day. She had gone first to Cincinnati, then to St. Louis, moving with the careful randomness of someone who had read enough crime reports to understand that predictable patterns were how people got found. In St. Louis, she had seen the advertisement in the Frontier Gazette, a territorial paper that had somehow found its way to a reading room table, and she had read it twice and then copied it down in her small, precise handwriting. The advertisement said, "Wanted, experienced housekeeper for working cattle ranch, Cimarron County, New Mexico Territory. Must be capable and reliable. Inquire C. Yates, Box 14, Cimarron Post." She had written a letter that was entirely truthful in all its specific claims and carefully selective in what it chose to emphasize. She said she had experience managing large households. She said she was capable of all domestic duties. She said she was seeking a position in a remote location due to a preference for quieter living. Every single word was accurate. The picture they painted together was something considerably less complete than the truth. Clark Yates had written back within 2 weeks. His letter was brief and direct and grammatically precise in a way that suggested someone who had been educated beyond what his circumstances might immediately imply. He offered a wage, described the duties, and said that the ranch was 18 miles from the town of Cimarron, that it ran approximately 2,000 head of cattle across 4,000 acres, and that he had a cook already but the house needed managing. She had accepted. She had arrived at the Yates Ranch on a Tuesday morning in February of 1883, having ridden the last stretch on a hired horse from Cimarron, because the roads were too soft for the wagon, and she had ridden into a yard that was busier than she expected, with 3 ranch hands moving around a corral fence in the sharp morning air, and a border collie that came at her with tremendous enthusiasm, and Clark Yates himself standing at the top of the porch steps, watching her arrive. He was 34 years old. He was broad-shouldered in the way of men who have done physical labor since adolescence, with dark hair gone slightly silver at the temples and a face that was weathered but not rough, the kind of face that reads as intelligent before it reads as handsome, though it was both. He had, she noticed immediately, the kind of eyes that land on you and stay there, dark and unhurried, like he had decided that whatever was worth looking at was worth looking at properly. He said, "Miss Bell," she said. "Yes." He said, "Welcome to the Yates Ranch." And that had been the beginning. For the first 3 weeks, Maude had been exactly what her letter had promised. She managed the house with the same thorough precision she had brought to every task in her professional life, and she did it with the particular discretion of someone who understood that her survival depended on being so good at her job that no one thought to ask too many questions about who she really was. She organized the pantry. She established a cleaning schedule. She managed the household accounts with an efficiency that quietly startled Clark's foreman, a weathered Texan named Dale Briggs, who had been keeping those accounts in a spiral of cheerful approximation for years. She did not, however, manage to be invisible to Clark Yates. He was, as she had assessed on that first morning, and as subsequent weeks only confirmed, a man of genuine and dangerous intelligence. Not the showy kind that announces itself constantly. The quiet kind that observes first and speaks second, and by the time it says anything has already understood 3 layers more of the situation than anyone around it has caught up to yet. He ran his ranch with methodical competence and treated his hands with a fairness that was not loudly proclaimed, but was clearly felt, because men who work for fair employers have a particular ease around them that is unmistakable if you know what you are looking for. He also, Maude noticed, read everything he could get his hands on. The ranch had a small library, shelves fitted into the far wall of the main room, and on the evenings when she moved through the house doing the last of her tasks, she could see him there by the lamp, working his way through whatever the last supply run to Cimarron had brought back. Legal theory, engineering, natural history, a battered copy of Adam Smith that looked like it had crossed the country twice. She had stood in the doorway one evening in late February and watched him read without his being aware of it, and she had felt something close in her chest that she had deliberately, carefully not examined. He had looked up then with that unhurried attentiveness and said, "There is coffee left if you want it." "Thank you," she said. "I will." She sat in the armchair across from him, and he went back to his book, and the fire burned, and the wind moved outside, and it was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her since the brick came through the window in Philadelphia, though she would not have been able to explain that coherently at the time. By the end of February, he had begun asking her opinions on things. First on domestic matters, on which supplier in Cimarron offered the better credit terms, on whether the kitchen garden layout she'd proposed would be practical given the late frost dates in that elevation. Then, gradually, on other things. On the proposed new fence line that Dale Briggs had submitted to him, on whether the price offered for a cut of the herd at the spring fair was worth taking or holding for fall. She answered carefully. She had been answering carefully all her life. But she answered him, and each time he listened with the same focused quality he brought to everything else, and each time she felt slightly more like a person who was permitted to be fully herself, which was the most disorienting experience she had encountered in some years. And then, in the second week of March, she had found the letter. It had not been addressed to her. It had been addressed to a Mr. Elias Drummond, care of a bank in Santa Fe, and it was written in a hand she did not recognize, and it had come in with a batch of general correspondence, clearly placed there deliberately, meant to be found, meant to communicate that she had been located without yet making any overt move. A warning shot across the bow, as her father would have said. She had stood in the hallway with the letter in her hand for 4 long minutes, reading it 3 times, and then she had made a decision she was not entirely sure was correct but could not think how to avoid. She had walked into the kitchen and put the letter on the floor and stood there and waited for Clark to come in from the yard, which was, of course, the moment where we began. Now she was sitting across the kitchen table from him in the light of the afternoon, and she had told him everything, and the kitchen had grown quiet around her accounting, and Clark Yates had listened to all of it without interruption, which was its own particular form of attention, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You testified against a man who robs charities, and then his judge and witnesses protected him, and now he's hunting you. That is a serviceable summary. And you have been alone in this for 6 months. It was not a question, but it had the weight of one." "I did not have anyone to be unalone with," she said, and the simplicity of it landed harder than she expected, in her own chest as much as anywhere. Clark got up and went to the window and looked out at the yard for a moment, and Maude watched his back and the set of his shoulders and tried to read what was being thought in that particular posture and found she could not, which was unusual for her. He turned around and said, "You are not going anywhere. I beg your pardon. You have been running for 6 months. You are staying here." He said it with the measured certainty of someone stating a fact about geography. "I have 4,000 acres and 3 armed men, and I know this land better than any operative Drummond is likely to send out from Philadelphia. You are staying." Maude opened her mouth. "Unless," he added, with a precision that suggested he was aware of the potential objection, "you have a compelling reason to continue running that involves something other than fear, in which case I would like to hear it." She closed her mouth. "I thought not," he said, and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat back down. There was a silence that was different from the earlier silence. Earlier, the silence had been the space in which she was making confessions. This silence had more the quality of a decision that had already been made. "You should understand," Maude said carefully, "that the association with me carries risk. I understand risk. Drummond is not a small-scale operation. He has resources and he has connections, and he is the kind of man who does not leave accounts open. I know men like that. Clark." She used his name and then was immediately conscious of having used it without the proper prefix and started to correct herself. "Don't," he said quietly. "It's fine." She let it stand. "He will come here eventually or send someone. Then we will deal with that when it comes." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "In the meantime, you should know that the monthly accounting you have been doing on the ranch ledgers is the clearest those books have been in 4 years. And Dale Briggs told me yesterday that you saved us $40 on the spring grain order by negotiating directly with the supplier instead of going through the Cimarron merchant. And if you are the most overqualified housekeeper in the West, then the West is lucky to have you." The warmth that moved through her was so unexpected and so complicated that she had to look away from him for a moment, out the window, at the flat, brilliant blue of the New Mexico sky. "I am good at my job," she said, because it was true and because it was easier than saying the other things. "You are exceptional at your job," he said, "and I have known since approximately your 3rd day here that the job was not all you were." She looked back at him. "The way you read a ledger," he said. "The way you reconstructed the filing system in the office. The way you talked to the suppliers." He paused. "A woman who has only ever managed a household does not know how to do those things with that kind of fluency. I noticed. I was waiting for you to tell me in your own time." "You were very patient about it," she said. "I have found that people tell you what you need to know when they trust you enough to tell you," he said. "Pushing tends to drive them in the wrong direction." Maude Bell sat with that for a moment. Outside, a hawk turned high above the south pasture, riding the thermal currents with a kind of effortless precision that seemed entirely too apt as metaphor. "What do we do now?" she asked. "First," said Clark, "I am going to ride to Cimarron tomorrow and send a telegraph to a man I know in Santa Fe who has connections with the Territorial Marshal's office. I want to know if Drummond has anyone currently operating in New Mexico territory. Second, I am going to have Dale install a proper bar on the outer kitchen door, because that lock is inadequate. Third," he paused, "I would like you to consider whether you have any remaining documentation from the original Hargrove case, because if you do, and if it can be submitted to a federal court rather than a state one, the jurisdiction considerations change considerably." Maude stared at him. "I read," he said simply, "including legal theory." She had, in fact, retained copies of every piece of documentation she had ever compiled on Elias Drummond. She had not done this accidentally. She had done it with the same forward-looking precision that had characterized her professional approach to everything, tucking copies into a leather case that currently lived under the floorboard of her room in the east wing of the ranch house. She had carried that case through Cincinnati and St. Louis, and across the territory, and not once had she mentioned it to a single person, because trusting people with the knowledge of its existence was the exact kind of vulnerability that got people killed. She said, "I may have some additional materials." Clark's expression did not change precisely, but something in it shifted in the way that a landscape shifts when the sun moves behind a cloud, a subtle change with significant implications. "How much additional?" "Enough," she said, "to reopen the case, if the venue were correct and the judge were not in Drummond's pocket." The silence that followed this had the quality of a plan being born. "All right," said Clark Yates. "Then here is what we are going to do." The next several weeks had the quality of two people working in parallel toward something they have not yet named out loud, but both fully understand. Clark rode to Cimarron the following morning and sent his telegraph, and came back with news that there had indeed been an inquiry in town about a woman matching Maude's description, made by a man who claimed to be a traveling buyer, but who had the wrong kind of hands for it, too clean for legitimate commerce, and too watchful for someone with nothing to hide. This information landed in Maude's chest like a cold stone, but she did not let it change her behavior in any visible way. This was something she had become skilled at: the management of fear, the performance of steadiness in the presence of threat. What she did instead was spend 3 evenings going through the leather case under the floorboard, organizing its contents with the systematic precision she applied to everything. And she produced, at the end of those 3 evenings, a stack of documents that represented 4 years of Drummond's financial fraud, arranged in an order of argument that was so clear and so well supported that she thought it might survive even a hostile judge. She brought the documents to Clark on a Thursday evening and spread them on the dining table under the lamp, and walked him through them, and watched him read. He read in the way she had by now identified as characteristic, without comment, without interruption, but with a quality of attention so complete that you felt it almost physically. He read for an hour and a half while Maude sat across from him and drank her coffee and watched the lamp flame move in the draught from the window, and tried not to notice how the lamplight fell across his face in a way that made thinking about anything else unnecessarily difficult. When he finished, he looked up. "This is damning," he said. "Yes." He knew this existed. He knew I had compiled it. He did not know I had retained copies. I allowed him to believe the originals were the only versions. Something moved in Clark's eyes that might in another register have been admiration. "That was deliberate. Everything I do is deliberate," she said, and then heard the edge in her own voice and softened it slightly. "I hoped I would not need them, but I kept them in case I did. You planned for the case failing before it failed. I planned for the possibility. There is a difference. Not much of one in this case." He looked back at the documents, then back at her. "I know a federal circuit judge. His name is Harrison Aldis, and he rides the New Mexico and Colorado circuit. He is honest, which I say not as a compliment but as a factual distinction from most of his colleagues. He was a friend of my father's." Maude straightened slightly in her chair. "A federal judge. Federal jurisdiction means Drummond's Philadelphia connections carry considerably less weight." Clark's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a kind of controlled urgency. "If we can get these documents to Aldis through a proper federal submission, with a territorial marshal providing the chain of custody, the evidentiary standards are different, and Drummond cannot reach a federal bench as easily." "When does Judge Aldis next ride his circuit through New Mexico?" "He will be in Santa Fe in June. That is 11 weeks. And the man in Cimarron who was asking after me has not come any closer than town, as far as I can tell, but 11 weeks is a long time." They looked at each other across the lamplight and the documents, and the magnitude of what they were attempting sat between them like a third presence at the table. "Why are you doing this?" Maude asked. She had been asking this question internally for days, and had decided that the only way to understand the answer was to say the question aloud. Clark was quiet for a moment, not the hesitant kind of quiet, but the kind that means a person is choosing their words with appropriate care. "Because what was done to you was wrong," he said. "Because a system that was supposed to protect you failed you, and you have been carrying the weight of that alone for 6 months. Because you did the right thing and got punished for it, and I have spent enough years watching that happen to good people to be entirely finished being a bystander to it. That is a general principle, she said. That does not explain specifically why you are extending yourself on behalf of your housekeeper. Something changed in his face then. It was small, that change. He was a man of considerable self-command. But she was watching him closely, had been watching him closely for weeks with the same attentiveness that he had been giving to her, and she saw it. "You are not my housekeeper," he said, and let the sentence be exactly that long. The silence after this was very full. "Clark," she said carefully. "I am not going to complicate your situation," he said. "I am stating a fact for the record. You are a woman of extraordinary intelligence and capability who has been forced into a position far below what you are worth by circumstances that should never have existed. The fact that you are currently employed in my house does not make you my housekeeper in any meaningful sense. It makes you someone who is using what was available to her to survive. There is a considerable difference." Maude was quiet. She was quiet in the way of someone whose internal landscape is undergoing significant rearrangement and needs a moment to let the new geography settle. "You said that very carefully," she observed. "I meant it carefully." She nodded once slowly and looked down at the documents on the table. When she looked back up, she said, 11 weeks is a long time. We should plan for multiple contingencies." He understood what she was doing, this she could tell from the slight adjustment in his expression, and he accepted it without pressing, which was the thing that kept making him dangerous. He said, "Yes, let us start with what we know about Drummond's methodology." They worked until midnight, and when Maude went to her room she lay in the dark for a long time looking at the ceiling of the east wing, and listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. The creak of wood contracting in the cooling air, the distant sound of the cattle, the soft bark of the border collie from somewhere near the barn. And she thought about a man who had said, "You are not my housekeeper," in the same measured tone another man might use to state a geological fact. And she felt herself quietly and methodically falling off a cliff. She was not, she told herself, going to do anything about this. She had a case to rebuild and a document package to protect, and a dangerous man hunting her across 2 territories, and the absolute last thing she needed was to add the complication of whatever was accumulating between herself and Clark Yates to the existing list of hazards. She had always been practical. She would be practical now. She fell asleep eventually and dreamed of nothing she could remember clearly, only a general sense of warmth that she did not want to wake from. The weeks that followed had their own particular rhythm. The ranch work continued, the cattle moving with the season toward better grass, the hands doing the hard physical work of that transition, while Maude managed the house and the accounts, and increasingly, the administrative correspondence that came in related to Clark's ongoing business arrangements. He had not asked her to take this on. She had simply done it because it needed doing and she was competent to do it. And one morning he had come into the office and found her at his desk with a stack of correspondence. She had already sorted, answered, and filed, and had stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression she had not been able to read entirely. He had said, "I have not paid you enough." She had said, "No, you have not," and they had looked at each other for a moment, and then he had smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, without the controlled quality that was his default, and it did something considerable to her internal steadiness. He paid her more. She did not tell him it was unnecessary. In the 4th week of their planning, Dale Briggs came in from Cimarron with the information that the traveling buyer had been replaced by a different man. This one, a proper Pinkerton detective by the look of him, who had been asking more specific questions and had been directed, apparently, by someone in town who knew that a woman from Philadelphia was employed out at the Yates place. This was the first moment of genuine crisis. "Who told him?" Clark asked. "Merchant named Fellows," Dale said, looking uncomfortable. "I don't think he meant any harm. The detective said he was looking for a missing person, gave a description. Fellows made the connection. Clark was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dale, I need you to do something for me. Whatever you need, boss. I need you to ride back into town and tell Fellows, and anyone else who might have had the same conversation, that Miss Bell left the ranch 3 weeks ago to take a position in Colorado. I need that information to be in wide circulation by the time that Pinkerton man comes asking again." Dale looked between his employer and Maude with the expression of a man putting together a picture whose full dimensions had just become apparent to him. "Yes, sir," he said, and did not ask further questions, which was why he had worked for Clark for 8 years. After Dale left, Maude said, "That buys us time." "It does not solve the problem." "No, but time is what we need," she thought for a moment. "If Drummond has sent a Pinkerton, he is serious. The Pinkerton agency has national reach. They can follow a trail across territories. How much do they know about who you really are? Not just the physical description, but the full identity. Drummond knows my name and my background. If he's given a Pinkerton my full information, they can trace me through official channels, employment records, university documents. Can they connect Maude Bell from Philadelphia to Maude Bell at the Yates Ranch through a paper trail? Possibly, if they contact the right institutions. I did not use a false name, which was perhaps not my finest planning decision. You were not expecting to need a false name." "No, I was hoping distance would be sufficient." She pressed her fingertips to the table's edge in the way she had when thinking hard. "What we need is for the case to move faster than the detective. If the documents reach Judge Aldous before Drummond's people locate me definitively, the legal situation changes. He cannot easily pressure a federal judge in the middle of active proceedings. 11 weeks was our original timeline. Can it be shortened?" She thought about this. "If I wrote to Judge Aldous directly, a formal legal communication, properly structured with the evidence attached as exhibits. If I presented it not as a request but as a formal filing of evidentiary material in support of a federal fraud investigation, would he receive it as such? If it is written correctly, and if it is delivered by someone he trusts, yes." She looked at Clark. "You said he was your father's friend." "He was. Could you write to him? A personal introduction, explaining the circumstances, asking him to receive the documents as a preliminary filing before his circuit arrives in Santa Fe." Clark was already nodding. "Yes, I can do that today." They wrote the letters together that afternoon, Clark at the desk and Maude at the side table, the documents spread between them, the territorial sun moving across the floor as the hours went by. And there was in the whole process something that felt to Maude like partnership in the truest sense she had ever encountered it. Not the condescending assistance of someone doing you a favor. Not the cautious cooperation of people who do not quite trust each other. Something equal, something built on the assumption that both parties had something essential to contribute, and that the outcome would be better for the combining. When the letters were finished and the documents packaged, Clark looked at what they had assembled together and said, "I will take this to Santa Fe myself. Santa Fe is 3 days' ride. I am aware. You would be leaving the ranch for 6 days minimum. Dale can manage it. Clark." She said his name in the way she had been trying not to say it, with the weight of everything she was thinking behind it. "You do not have to do this." He looked at her for a long time. "Maude," he said, and the way he said her name had the same weight hers had carried when she said his, and they were both aware of this, standing on opposite sides of the desk with an afternoon's worth of careful partnership between them. "I do not have to do a great many things that I nonetheless choose to do. This is one of them." She held his gaze and did not look away. "Be careful," she said. "Always," he said. He left the following morning before dawn. Maude watched him ride out from the porch in the gray pre-sunrise air, and stood there for a few minutes after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, feeling the particular vulnerability of having entrusted the most important thing in her life to another person, and having no way to verify or control what happened next. It was not a feeling she was accustomed to. She had spent the better part of 3 years controlling every available variable, and the better part of 6 months making herself a moving target precisely so that no one else's decisions could determine her fate. She went back inside and made breakfast and told herself to be practical. The 6 days of Clark's absence were productive, in the way that anxiety makes a person productive. Maude organized every remaining corner of the ranch house with a thoroughness that Dale Briggs later said made him feel that the house had been taken apart and rebuilt from better components. She also, during those 6 days, had 2 conversations that mattered. The first was with Dale himself, on the 4th day, when he came in from the eastern fence line where a section had given way, and she was in the yard with the border collie, whose name was Pepper, and he stopped to give her a direct look that suggested something was on his mind. "I want you to know," Dale said, in the blunt way of a man who has decided to say a thing, "that whatever you need while the boss is gone, me and the other fellows are here for it. If anyone comes around asking questions, we don't know anything about anyone." Maude looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Dale." "He's a good man," Dale said. "Clark Yates, best employer I've had in 20 years working cattle. I don't say that easily." He paused, adjusting his hat in the way of someone who has said the important part and is now managing the awkwardness of having said it out loud. "I reckon you know that already." "I am becoming aware of it," Maude said. Dale nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to his fence repairs. The second conversation was with a woman named Rosa Castillo, who drove out from the neighboring property with a wagon load of dried peppers and squash on the 5th day, because she and Clark had a standing arrangement for exchanging goods, and who accepted Maude's invitation to come inside for coffee with the warmth of someone who had been making her own way in a difficult country for a long time, and recognized the same quality in others. Rosa Castillo was 45 years old, a widow, running a small farm 3 miles to the east with her grown son, and she had the particular quality of intelligence that expresses itself primarily through observation. She drank her coffee and looked at the reorganized kitchen and then looked at Maude with a slight smile. "He does not usually have help this good," Rosa said. "I imagine he has managed adequately." "Adequately, yes, but adequate is a poor thing next to good." Rosa set her coffee cup down with a deliberate care that suggested she was about to say something worth listening to. "He has been alone a long time, Clark, since his wife died. 7 years. Maude had not known about a wife. She absorbed this information with what she hoped was a neutral expression. "I did not know he had been married. She died of a fever in the winter of '76. They had been married 2 years. Rosa's voice was matter of fact, not unkind. "He loved her well and he grieved her for a long time, but 7 years is long enough for grief, and a man like that should not be alone." "Mrs. Castillo," Maude said carefully. "I am not matchmaking," Rosa said with a slight raise of her hands. "I am only telling you what is, because you look at him in a way that I recognize. I used to look at my husband that way." She smiled then, a small and genuine smile. "It is a look that is trying very hard not to be noticed." Maude said nothing. "The question," Rosa said, picking up her coffee again, "is not whether the feeling is there. The question is always what you are brave enough to do with it." On the 6th day, Clark came back. He rode in late in the afternoon, dusty from 3 days of riding on top of whatever he'd dealt with in Santa Fe, and Maude was on the porch when he came through the gate, and she felt the relief of it move through her in a way that was not, she had to concede, purely professional in character. He dismounted and handed Pepper the greeting she was determinedly demanding, and looked up at the porch with an expression that suggested things had gone well and also that he was very tired. "He received them," Clark said, coming up the steps. "Aldous. He read the covering letter while I waited. He said the materials would be evaluated formally, but that preliminary review suggested substantive merit." Maude let out a slow breath. "He accepted them as a filing." "He accepted them as a filing, yes. He said to expect contact within 4 weeks. He will ride the circuit to Santa Fe on schedule, which is 8 weeks from now, and expects to convene a preliminary hearing at that time." 8 weeks. Maude nodded, And the Pinkerton, still in the area by all accounts, but with the materials now in federal custody, Drummond's operational situation is considerably more complicated. Interfering with a federal proceeding is a different category of crime than harassing a private citizen. He may not know yet that the materials have been filed. No, but he will. Clark looked at her directly. When he does, his calculus will change. We have perhaps 2 weeks before word reaches Philadelphia and he adjusts his strategy. 2 weeks, she said, and then we wait for Santa Fe and we do not do anything that makes us more visible. He paused. And we are careful, she nodded. He nodded. There was a moment in which they were standing approximately 4 feet apart on the porch in the late afternoon light, both aware of the ground they had covered together and both, she thought, aware of the other thing, the thing that had been accumulating in the background of everything else with the patient and inevitable quality of weather. "You should eat something," she said. "You look like you have not eaten since Albuquerque." "About that," he said. She went inside to fix him a plate, and he sat at the kitchen table and ate with the straightforward hunger of a man who had been riding hard, and she sat across from him and watched him and felt, with a clarity that was almost annoying in its completeness, that she had stopped running. Not because the danger was resolved, because it was not, but because she had arrived somewhere that felt, for the first time in 6 months, like ground she did not want to leave. The following 2 weeks had the quality of a held breath. The Pinkerton man made one visit to the ranch gate and was met by Dale Briggs, who informed him with complete sincerity that Miss Bell had indeed departed for Colorado 6 weeks ago and had left no forwarding address. The Pinkerton, whose name turned out to be a Mr. Colville, accepted this with the professional skepticism of his trade and went away to verify it through other channels, and did not come back immediately. They were, however, not idle. Maude spent those 2 weeks drafting the supplementary documentation that Judge Aldis's office had requested, additional affidavits and evidential summaries that required the kind of precise legal reasoning she had once applied to the original compilation and had not had occasion to use in 6 months. She worked at the desk in the ranch office and Clark worked beside her often, his own ledgers and correspondence spread around him, and the quality of their shared silence had changed in the weeks since his return from Santa Fe. It was warmer now, more familiar. Less like 2 people carefully maintaining appropriate distances, and more like 2 people who had tacitly agreed to let those distances be what they needed to be rather than what convention suggested they should be. One evening, toward the end of the 2nd week, they were sitting with the last of the day's work between them, and Clark was reading through a draft summary she had written, and he made a correction in the margin with his pencil, a single word change, and slid it back across the desk. She read the correction. It was better than what she had written. She looked up. "You wrote the better word," she said. "I read a lot of legal documents." That is not the same as having a feel for evidentiary language. Apparently it is sometimes. He set his pencil down. "My father wanted me to study law. I chose the ranch instead after he died. The land was more pressing than a career that required going east and spending years in classrooms." "Do you regret it?" he considered. "No. I am exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I want to do, and the ranch gives me enough intellectual engagement to avoid the particular poverty of a boring life." He paused. "What about you? Do you regret going east, taking the education?" It was the first time he had asked her something so directly personal that wasn't immediately practical in its application. "Never," she said. "Whatever it cost me, I would not give back a single class, a single year. My father gave me that, the belief that my mind was worth developing regardless of what anyone else thought it was worth. I will not betray that gift by pretending I wish I'd been less. No one should have to make that concession. No, they should not. But most women I know have made it in one form or another." She looked at him across the desk and said what she had been thinking about since Rosa Castillo's visit. "Were you and your wife happy before she died?" He did not look surprised by the question, which meant either that he had been expecting it or that he simply did not startle easily, and she thought it was probably both. "Yes," he said. "We were happy. She was a good woman and we suited each other." He was quiet for a moment. "I have not talked about her much in the years since." Not because the grief was unresolvable, but because there was no one to talk to who would have understood the particular combination of love and loss and time that adds up to what it becomes after 7 years. "What does it become?" she asked gently. "Something you carry quietly," he said. "Not heavy, not sharp, just present." He looked at her steadily. "I am not a man who is looking backward, Maude. I want you to know that." The room was very still. "I know," she said. They held each other's gaze for a moment that lasted long enough to be something more than accidental, and then Clark said, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided to say something true and is going to say it properly, "I would like to ask you something that you do not have to answer until you are ready. Ask it. When this is over. When the case is resolved and you are no longer a fugitive and you have your life back." He paused. "What do you want it to look like?" The question landed somewhere deep in her chest and sat there. "I have not allowed myself to think about after," she said honestly. "After has felt like too dangerous a luxury. I understand, but I am asking you to think about it now." His voice was level and warm and entirely serious. "Because I am interested in being part of whatever answer you come up with, if that is something you could want. And I would rather say that while there is time to be considered about it than wait until after and say it in haste." Maude Bell sat with this, with the fact that a man had just said something that honest and that careful and that clear, and she felt the thing she had been managing for weeks finally come to rest as what it actually was. "I think," she said slowly, "that what I want after is something that looks like this specifically. The work, the land, the sense of being entirely useful." She paused. "And the person across the desk from me if he is still interested." The smile he gave her then was not the full one she had seen once before. It was quieter than that, the kind of smile that does not need to be large to carry considerable weight. "He is still interested," Clark said. It was not a kiss. It was not a declaration in the theatrical sense. It was something more durable than either of those things. It was two people deciding, in clear daylight, with full awareness of what it meant, to choose each other. Deliberately, precisely. Which was, Maude thought, exactly how both of them did everything. The 6 weeks between that evening and the Santa Fe hearing were not without difficulty. 3 weeks in, a letter arrived from Drummond directly, addressed this time to Clark, informing him with a venomous clarity that he was harboring a criminal, and that his cooperation with an ongoing lawful investigation would be expected or consequences would follow. Clark read this letter once, wrote a brief and legally precise response citing the active federal proceedings and the relevant statutes regarding obstruction, and sent it back. "Will that stop him?" Maude asked. "It will make him think twice. He is not foolish, whatever else he is. Going after a man in active cooperation with a federal circuit judge's office is a different proposition than going after a woman on the run. He may try something before the hearing. He may, which is why Dale and I have been riding the property line every morning, and why I have written to Marshal Everett in Cimarron to ask for a deputy to camp at the gate for the next few weeks. You arranged a deputy without telling me." "I arranged it yesterday and was going to tell you tonight." He looked at her calmly. "I am not managing things behind your back. I am managing things in the sequence in which they became arrangeable." She took a breath. "I have been making all my own decisions for a very long time. I know you are still making them. I am simply doing my portion alongside you." He paused. "Is that acceptable?" She had to smile at that. "Yes," she said, "it is acceptable." The deputy, a young man named Tomas Herrera who was half Mexican and entirely competent, arrived the following day and took up his post with a quiet efficiency that reminded Maude slightly of herself. He was there 3 days later when Mr. Colville the Pinkerton rode back out to the gate, and this time had a more specific set of questions, including references to the name Maude Bell and the city of Philadelphia. Tomas declined to answer any questions not addressed through official channels. Mr. Colville went away. He did not come back. 2 weeks before the scheduled hearing, a letter arrived from Judge Aldis's office confirming the date and time of the preliminary hearing in Santa Fe and requesting the attendance of the evidentiary source, which meant Maude, for the purpose of formal identification of the materials and preliminary testimony. She read the letter 3 times. "This is real," she said. "It has been real for some time," Clark said. "Now it has a date on it." She looked at him. "I am going to have to testify again." "Yes. The last time I testified, the case fell apart." "The last time you testified in a state court with a compromised judge and intimidated witnesses. This is a federal preliminary with a circuit judge who has a reputation that is better than his salary would suggest possible." He crossed to where she was standing with the letter and stood close to her and said, "You built this case. You have carried it across 6 months and 2,000 miles. You know it better than anyone alive. You are going to walk into that courtroom and lay it out, and it is going to stand, because it is solid and you are more than capable of presenting it." She looked up at him and felt the steadiness of his certainty like something she could lean into. "Will you come with me?" she asked. "To Santa Fe?" "I was already planning to," he said. They rode to Santa Fe 2 days before the hearing, taking the main road south through the territory, camping one night under a sky so thick with stars that Maude lay in her bedroll and felt, for the first time in longer than she could calculate, that the world was large and open rather than narrowing around her like a trap. She said, quietly to the darkness and to Clark, who was lying with his head on his saddle 6 feet away, "I used to dream about open country when I was in Philadelphia. I would look out the office window at the city and think about what it would be like to see an actual horizon." "Is it what you imagined?" "No," she said. "It is considerably better than what I imagined." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been thinking about what this land could be if it were managed with the kind of rigor you bring to everything." "What do you mean?" "The ranch accounts, the water rights, the grazing rotation I have been trying to work out for 3 seasons. You looked at it once 2 weeks ago and pointed out an error in my rotation plan that had been costing me yield. You saw it in 10 minutes." He paused. "You could do that consistently for the whole operation, Clark." "I'm not suggesting a formal title," he said, and she could hear in his voice the smile that was happening in the darkness. "I am suggesting a partnership, in all practical senses." "All practical senses," she repeated, "and any other senses that present themselves." She was quiet for a moment, watching the stars, feeling the particular quality of the night air that was different from anything she had ever breathed in the city, clean and dry and somehow ancient. "I think," she said, "that is the most Clark Yates way of proposing anything that I could possibly imagine. I could try a different approach." "No," she said, and smiled in the dark. "That one was perfect." The hearing in Santa Fe was held in the federal courthouse on Palace Avenue on a Wednesday morning in June of 1883, and it was the most frightening and most important 2 hours of Maude Bell's life. Judge Harrison Aldis was 62 years old, thin and white-haired, and possessed of the kind of concentrated alertness that made you feel, when he was looking at you, that you were being read like text. He had reviewed the preliminary materials and had clearly done so with genuine attention. His questions were precise and not unkind, and he directed them at Maude in the manner of a man who had already decided that the source was credible and was now verifying the documentation rather than the person. She answered each question with the same exactness she had brought to every task of her life. She traced the evidence. She identified the documents. She explained the methodology of the original compilation and the chain of custody that had preserved their integrity across 6 months of flight. She was composed and thorough and entirely present. When she finished, Clark, who had been seated in the gallery throughout, was looking at her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before and could not immediately name. Judge Aldis said, "Miss Bell, the documentation you have submitted constitutes, in my preliminary assessment, substantive evidence of federal mail fraud and wire fraud violations under the Act of 1872. I am directing the U.S. Marshals Service to formally receive these materials and to initiate a federal investigation. A grand jury will be convened. You will receive formal notification of subsequent proceedings. He paused. I am also issuing a formal order of protection requiring that all agents, private or otherwise, employed by the subject of this investigation cease and desist any activities directed at the identifying, locating, or contacting of the evidentiary source. He looked at her over his glasses. You are protected under federal court authority as of this moment. Is that clear? Yes, she said. Thank you, Your Honor. She walked out of that courtroom into the bright June heat of Santa Fe, and Clark was beside her on the courthouse steps, and she stopped walking because her legs had decided, without consulting her, that they needed a moment. He put his hand on her arm, steady and warm. Breathe, he said quietly. She breathed. It is over, she said. The running, it is over. The running is over, he confirmed. She turned to look at him in the full sun, this man who had read her correctly from the third day, who had built her a plan instead of sending her away, who had ridden 3 days to Santa Fe and sat in a federal gallery watching her give testimony with that particular expression she still had not found the right word for. Clark, she said. Yes. I would like very much to go home now. He smiled, full and unguarded, the way she had seen it only twice before. Then let us go home, he said. They were back at the Yates ranch by the end of the week, and the quality of their return was different from anything that had preceded it. The urgency was gone. The held-breath quality of every day was gone. What remained was the ranch and the summer sky, and the work they both loved, and the thing between them that had been accumulating since February and was now, with no remaining practical justification for delay, going to be addressed with appropriate directness. On the evening of their third day back, Clark came into the kitchen where Maude was doing the last of the dinner things and said, without preamble, I would like to properly ask you to marry me. She turned from the basin with her hands still damp. That is the proper version. It seemed appropriate to be formal about it. She looked at him for a long moment in the kitchen lamplight, this man who had given her safety when she needed it and partnership when she needed that and patience through all of it, and said, yes, absolutely yes. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her for the first time, and it was not dramatic so much as it was definitive. The way everything they did together was definitive. Two people who had given the matter their full and careful consideration and arrived at the unambiguous conclusion. Dale Briggs, who was walking past the kitchen window at that exact moment, turned discreetly around and took himself off toward the bunkhouse, and later told Tomas Herrera and the other 2 hands that the boss and Miss Bell were getting married, and there was a general quality of satisfaction around the bunkhouse fire that evening that had nothing to do with the excellent supper Maude had sent out. They were married in September of 1883 in Cimarron, at the Episcopal Church, which had been the setting for approximately 2/3 of the significant events in that community's recent history. Rosa Castillo came, wearing a dress the color of the fall sky, and cried in a way that she would have firmly denied if pressed. Dale Briggs stood as witness with the solemnity of a man who takes his responsibilities seriously. Tomas Herrera, who had become a fixture at the ranch after his assignment there ended, attended and managed the practical arrangements with his characteristic efficiency. Maude wore a dress the color of deep amber, which she had bought in Santa Fe on the way back and which Clark, when he saw her in it, had been unable to say anything for a moment that was long enough for her to notice and file away with the other moments she was accumulating. The ceremony was brief. The words were serious. The look that passed between them when the words were said was the kind that people standing nearby remember for years afterward. The federal investigation into Elias Drummond proceeded through the fall and into the winter, and in February of 1884, exactly 1 year after Maude had arrived at the Yates ranch, A grand jury in Philadelphia returned a 23-count indictment against Drummond and 4 associates for mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Maude testified via written deposition, her materials provided by Judge Aldis's court, and Drummond's lawyers, faced with the federal documentation and the testimony of witnesses who were considerably harder to intimidate when they were operating under federal protection than they had been in a state court proceeding, failed to prevent the case from moving forward. Drummond's trial began in the spring of 1884 and lasted 6 weeks, and he was convicted on 19 of the 23 counts. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. Maude received the telegram announcing the verdict on a Tuesday morning in late April. She was in the ranch office, working through the spring accounts with the thoroughness that had by now resulted in the Yates ranch finances being in the best condition they had been in since Clark's father ran the place. Clark was out with the hands, moving the herd north toward the summer pasture. She read the telegram twice, and then she sat very still for a moment, and then she went to the door and called to Dale to tell Mr. Yates that she needed to see him when he came in. When Clark came in that evening, dust-covered and smelling of horses and spring grass, she met him in the yard with the telegram in her hand. He took it from her and read it, and then he looked at her, and she walked into his arms without saying anything, and he held her in the yard in the early evening light while Pepper circled them with her tail going at a speed that suggested complete agreement with the general state of affairs. "It is done," she said into his shoulder. "It is done," he confirmed, one hand in her hair. She stood there for a moment, feeling the solid permanence of him around her and the particular quality of relief that comes not when a danger passes, but when you finally, fully believe it has passed, a distinction that takes longer to arrive than the event itself. "I want to write to the families," she said, "of the people whose charitable accounts he stole from. I want them to know what happened. I want them to know why." "We will write the letters tonight," he said. They wrote the letters that evening, side by side at the dining table, and sent them with the week's mail run, and that was the last official thing that ever passed between Maude Bell Yates and the name Elias Drummond. The ranch in the years that followed became something that neither the land nor the ledgers had entirely promised it could be, but that the combination of Clark's practical knowledge and Maude's strategic precision had made inevitable. She formalized her role as the financial and administrative manager of the operation, and this was not a secret or a peculiarity, but simply the factual description of how the ranch was run. Suppliers in Cimarron knew to negotiate with her. The cattle buyers who came in from Taos and Trinidad knew that the price discussions happened with both of them, and that the woman in the amber-colored dress who handled the books was not someone to be clever with. She also began, in the second year, offering her financial consulting services to 2 other ranching operations in the county, quietly and on her own terms, and this became a small but significant additional income stream, and a source of the particular satisfaction that comes from being used at full capacity. Clark watched all of this with the same quality of attention he had brought to everything since the beginning, observant and steady, and not remotely inclined to diminish what she was doing, and they had between them a marriage that was remarkable not for its dramatics, but for its daily completeness, the sense on both sides of having found exactly the right other mind to be in proximity to. In the spring of 1885, their son was born. They named him James for Maude's father, and he arrived in the world with a considerable opinion about his own comfort and a pair of lungs that could be heard from the barn, and Clark held him in the lamplight of the bedroom with an expression that Maude, watching from the bed, thought was the most honest thing she had ever seen on a human face. "He has your nose," Clark said. "He has your stubbornness," she said, though she was smiling. "James Bell Yates," Clark said, and the name settled into the room like something that had always been true and was only now being said aloud. Rosa Castillo came the next day and held the baby and cried again, and denied it again, and Maude and Clark exchanged a look over her head that was, in its way, the perfect summary of everything they had built together. Two people who saw the same things at the same time and did not need to say everything out loud because the understanding between them was already that complete. James grew into a child of enormous curiosity and what his father called, with fond exasperation, an absolute refusal to accept a partial answer. He learned to read early and voraciously because both of his parents had books everywhere and treated reading as a standard activity rather than a special one. By the time he was 4, he was following Dale around the corrals asking questions about the cattle with a persistence that made Dale, who was not a man easily exhausted, visibly tired. "He is going to be a handful," Dale told Clark. "He already is," Clark agreed. "He asked me last week to explain how the water rights system works. He's 4. I explained it anyway. He followed most of it. In the winter of 1886, Maude discovered she was pregnant again. She told Clark on a quiet Sunday morning when the snow was on the mountains, and the house was warm and James was asleep, still, in the early light. She told him simply, as she told him everything, and he looked at her for a moment with that quiet warmth that was his particular form of joy. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was the thing that mattered most to him. "I am very well," she said. "Then I am very glad," he said. Their daughter arrived in the summer of 1887, on a hot July afternoon, and they named her Clara, which was a name they had been carrying around for several months without either of them suggesting it until Clark said it one evening while Maude was working at the desk, and she looked up and said, "Yes, that one." Clara was, from her first weeks, a person of serene and focused attention. She watched the world with dark eyes that her father said reminded him of someone he knew, and Maude said that if Clara turned out to be the kind of person who read ledgers for entertainment, she was going to accept it as her own fault. James took to being a brother with characteristic intensity, appointing himself Clara's primary explainer of the world, which she tolerated with an equanimity that suggested excellent temperament. Dale said that the Yates children were the most interesting children in Cimarron County, and meant it as the highest compliment he was capable of giving. The New Mexico Territory moved toward statehood in those years, and with it came changes that Clark and Maude both watched with the attentive engagement of people who understood what the political structures meant for the lives being lived under them. The territorial laws regarding women's property rights were imperfect and often maddening, and Maude, who was running an increasingly significant portion of the county's agricultural economy through her consulting practice, made herself a consistent and articulate presence at the public meetings where these things were discussed. She was not always listened to. This was not something that surprised her or stopped her. She had spent her professional life being the most capable person in rooms that were reluctant to admit her competence, and she had long since learned that persistence and precision were more durable tools than frustration. Clark attended every meeting she spoke at, seated in the gallery with James on his knee in the early years, and when people looked sideways at the fact of her speaking with the authority she did, he simply looked back at them with the steady dark eyes that conveyed, without any need for words, that he had heard nothing worth questioning. He was asked once, by a rancher named Guthrie who had been resistant to the whole concept of Maude's consulting work, why he let his wife handle the financial side of things. Clark looked at him for a moment with an expression of genuine consideration. Then he said, "She is better at it than I am. Why would I not?" Guthrie did not have a good answer to this. Most people did not when Clark Yates said a thing with that particular quality of simple fact. Their third child, another boy they named Henry, came in 1889, the year that New Mexico was working toward a new constitution, and he was born in a world that was visibly, incrementally changing, in which women's capabilities were beginning, slowly, to be acknowledged as worth the acknowledgement. And Maude Bell Yates was among the women in Cimarron County who had spent the better part of a decade being precisely and unignorable evidence that this acknowledgement was overdue. Henry was a sunny-tempered child who seemed to have come into the world having already decided that everything was probably going to be fine, which was a disposition so different from his mother's and his father's focused intensity that it was something of a relief to everyone around him. James, who was by then 7 and consumed by the serious business of knowing everything about the ranch, accepted his youngest sibling with benign tolerance. Clara, who was 2 and had strong opinions about most things, was immediately convinced that Henry had been provided primarily for her entertainment. The ranch house had been expanded twice by this point, a process that Clark had managed with the same practical intelligence he brought to everything, adding rooms that were needed in the order they became needed and building them to last. The office was larger now, properly fitted with bookshelves that held not only the accumulated reading material of 2 people who treated books as necessities, but the growing collection of legal and financial reference materials that Maude's consulting work required. There was a moment, on a spring evening in 1890, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and Clark and Maude were sitting in the main room with their respective books, Pepper asleep in front of the fire she was too old now to be without, that Maude set her book down and looked at the room around her and felt something she had not had adequate access to for most of her adult life. Clark looked up from his own reading. "What?" "Nothing," she said. And then, because she did not like incomplete answers, contentment. "I was noticing what contentment feels like from the inside." He studied her for a moment, and, "It is quieter than I expected, and considerably more durable." She looked at him. "I used to think the thing I was working toward was security, safety, the ability to stop running, and those things are real and they matter, but what I did not anticipate was that the destination would feel like this." "Like what?" She looked around the room, at the books and the firelight and the dogs and the sounds of the children sleeping overhead, and at him, this man who had read her correctly from the very beginning and built something real and lasting alongside her. "Like home," she said. "I did not anticipate that it would feel like home." Clark set his book down too. He crossed to where she was sitting and sat beside her on the settle, and she leaned into his side in the way she had learned to in 7 years of marriage, and he put his arm around her in the way he always did, solid and certain. "You built this too," he said. "Everything here. You are not living in my home. You built this home as much as I did." She thought about that for a moment, about the accounts she had turned around, and the suppliers she had renegotiated, and the children who had been born here and the case that had finally ended the running, and the man beside her who had been smart enough to see her clearly when no one else had tried. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I did." The fire burned. Outside, the New Mexico territory moved through its spring night. The cattle settled on the south pasture, the mountains dark against a sky of extraordinary stars. Pepper made a small sleeping sound and her legs moved in some dream of running, and James turned over in his bed upstairs with the small sounds of a child deeply asleep. "I have been thinking," Clark said, "about expanding the herd next year. I want to talk to you about the financing." She smiled against his shoulder. "Of course you do. I have some ideas. You always do. Some of them are even good ones." "Some of them," she agreed, "are very good." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head with the easiness of long habit and deep familiarity, and she felt it in the same warm, settled way she felt everything that was true and permanent in her life. And they sat there in the firelight for a while longer, 2 people who had found each other in the particular way that requires both of them to be exactly who they are, both the one who runs and the one who is smart enough to see why she ran and steady enough to give her a reason to stop. In 1892, the New Mexico Territory submitted its second Constitutional Convention proceedings, and Maude was among the women who submitted formal written testimony on the subject of property rights, a document that was cited 3 times in the subsequent legislative debates, and that a lawyer in Santa Fe later called the clearest articulation of the economic argument for women's property rights that had been produced in the territory. She did not know about the lawyer's citation until Clark told her about it, having heard it from Judge Aldis's office in a letter about an entirely different matter. "You are being cited in legal debates," he said, holding the letter. "I am aware of what I submitted," she said. "You are also being called, and I am quoting this directly, a leading voice in the territory on matters of financial governance." She looked at him over the kitchen table. "Is that surprising? To you, no. To fellows at the general store, considerably." She laughed, which was a thing she did easily now, the way she had not been able to do easily for the years she was running, and the sound of it still had the quality of something given freely that had once been guarded. Clara, who was 5 and had developed the habit of appearing quietly in doorways, said from the kitchen entrance, "Mama, what is a leading voice?" "Someone who says important things out loud," Maude said. "Is that what you do?" "I try to." Clara considered this with the dark-eyed attention that her father's people said she'd inherited and her mother's people said was entirely her mother's. "I want to do that too," she said. "Then you will," Maude said. "You absolutely will." New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, but by that time the Yates family was 3 generations deep into the territory's story, and James Yates was 40 years old and managing the expanded ranch alongside his father, who was 66 and still riding the property line every morning with the same steady purpose he had brought to it at 34. And Clara Yates was a practicing attorney in Santa Fe, which was the kind of outcome that would have made Maude's father. The professor who had believed his daughter's mind was worth developing, sit down and weep with straightforward joy. Henry Yates had become, to everyone's mild surprise including his own, an engineer, working on the water infrastructure projects that were transforming the territory's agricultural capacity, applying his sunny pragmatism to problems that defeated more intense personalities. Maude was 62 in 1912, and she was still managing the ranch accounts and still consulting for 3 of the county's agricultural operations, and still had the leather case she had carried from Philadelphia in 1882, now residing on the shelf in the ranch office beside the Smith and the legal texts, a relic of a different life that she kept not as a reminder of fear, but as evidence of what a person is capable of enduring and then transcending. Clark, at 66, had the silver hair that had been only at his temples when she met him spread throughout, and the weathered face that had always read as intelligent before it read as handsome still read that way. And he still read everything he could get his hands on, and he still looked at her across whatever they were doing with those dark eyes that landed and stayed, and she still felt it the same way she had felt it in the lamplight of the ranch office in 1883. They were sitting on the porch one evening in May of 1912, with the first news of the approaching statehood vote spread in the newspaper between them and the mountains going gold in the late sun, and Clark said, "Do you remember what you told me when you first explained the case? You said you had been running for 6 months. I remember. You have been here 29 years. She looked at the mountains, at the land that she knew now in the same precise and cellular way she had once known the accounts of the Hargrove Institute, as something that lived in her hands as much as her head. 29 years, she said. Is that what you would have chosen if you'd known, coming here? Staying? She turned to look at him, this man who had been her partner and her match and her home for nearly 3 decades, whose intelligence had recognized hers before she had trusted anyone enough to show it, who had built something alongside her with the same deliberate precision she brought to everything. Yes, she said, without hesitation, without a single reservation, every day of it. He took her hand on the porch railing, the familiar warm certainty of it, and they watched the sun finish its business with the New Mexico mountains, and the cattle moved somewhere to the south with the low, settled sound of animals at peace, and somewhere in the house, a grandchild that James's wife had brought over that afternoon woke up and made its presence known with considerable energy, and the border collie who was Pepper's grandchild or great-grandchild, Maude had lost track, lifted its head and then decided everything was fine and put it back down. Clark said, "I have been thinking about the water rights on the north section again." "I know you have," she said. "You haven't heard my argument yet. I don't need to hear your argument yet to know you have been thinking about it. You get a particular look. What look? The one that means you have decided something and are preparing to present it as though you haven't decided it yet. He looked at her. Then he smiled, the full one, the unguarded one she had first seen 30 years ago in the kitchen and had been the beneficiary of every day since. You know me very well, he said. Yes, said Maude Bell Yates, squeezing his hand on the railing, feeling the weight of the day and the year and the decades and the whole long, beautiful, complicated story of how she had come to be exactly here, exactly herself, exactly known. I do. And the evening settled around the Yates ranch in the territory that was about to become a state, and the work would continue tomorrow, and the accounts would be managed, and the arguments about water rights would be had with the particular enjoyment of two people who liked a good argument when they both knew it would end in the same place it always ended, together. Which was where they had been since a Tuesday morning in February of 1883, when a woman rode in on a hired horse from Cimarron, and a man stood at the top of his porch steps and recognized, in the space of a single look, that he was in the presence of something extraordinary. He had been smart enough to know it then. He had been smart enough to do something about it. And everything, all of it, every careful and deliberate and loving choice that had followed, had been exactly enough.